Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss the basic difference between session.get and session.load APIs of Hibernate. Okay, so what I have done, I have created an Eclipse setup which I'll be using to demonstrate some very simple code examples. So as you know that get and load APIs are used to fetch data from the database. So I have created a very simple address entity which I'll be persisting it in database, and then using the get and load APIs I'll fetch the data to our Hibernate application. So the structure of this address entity is very simple. As you can see, it is having address ID as the key, address line 1, 2, city, pin code, address type and country. All these attributes are there, and I have created this table in my MySQL database, and currently it is containing only one row. Now as our setup is ready, let's try fetching the address data from the database using the get API. So the code for doing that is this. We are using a session.get method. There are several overloaded versions of this get method, but the one that you generally use takes in two parameters. First parameter is the type of entity class, the name of the entity class, and second one is the primary key for which you're trying to fetch the data. So I have written a system.out to display the class name which is returned by this get API, and address line 1 attribute of the returned entity. So if you look at the database, address line 1 column has this value, so this value should get printed. So let's run it. As you can see that Hibernate has fired a select query to pull out the data from the database, and the class that it is returned is of this type, which is correct, and also the address line 1 attribute value is this for this primary key. So the way this get API works internally is that first it will look for this entity instance in the session level cache, that is the first level cache. If it finds a entity instance there, then it returns that instance only, and if it does not find that instance in a session cache, then it looks in the second level cache, and if it still does not find any this particular entity instance in the second level cache, then it goes to the database, fires the select query and gets the entity object for you. Okay, to validate this understanding, let's try to fetch the address entity instance having primary key 1 again using the same get API. So now what will happen, since I have told you that the get API first looks at the entity instance in the first level cache, that is the session cache. So here it will find the instance in session level cache and it will return that instance only. So it will not go to the database and fire the select query for you. So now let's run it and validate this understanding. So as you can see, only one select query is fired. The second time, no query is fired because the instance is already found in the session cache. You can also add a second level cache to your application and validate this thing, but I'm not doing that thing as of now for simplicity. Okay, one more thing regarding session.get method is that suppose you are trying to fetch an entity which does not exist in the database. So in that case, this Hibernate will this session.get method of Hibernate API will return you null. So if you try to fetch such entity from the database, you can see that the return instance is, we have got a null pointer because we are trying to access some method on this null object. So it returns a null. Okay, now we are done with the get API. Now let's try the other API, other load API, and fetch the same data from the database and see how it works. So if I run this application now, I'll get this output. So one thing to note is that the type of class returned by the load API is not address, it is something else. And also the select query is not fired this time. So what is happening behind the scene is that the load API returns you a proxy object and not the actual address object. And this proxy object is not fully initialized. It is having only the key attribute of the address entity, and all other attributes are not initialized. So those attributes are initialized when you try to access some non-key attribute of this address object. So let's say I want to fetch this attribute of address object. So this time a select query will get fired and it will populate the proxy object. So initially the proxy object is uninitialized and a select query will get fired once you want to access any non-primary attribute of that proxy object. Okay, that is fine. Now another thing is, let's see the behavior of this load API once a entity does not exist in the database. So in this case, we have seen that get API was returning null. But in this case, the load API will throw an exception, an object not found exception. Okay, and this exception will be thrown when you try to access some non-primary attribute of this address object. If we are not accessing any attribute of this address class, then will not get this exception. Fine. I hope this behavior of load is clear to you. Why it is not throwing object not found exception here is because the load API is not firing a select query, so it does not know whether this object exists in the database or not. It only comes to know about this when we are trying to access some non-primary attribute. At that point, it sees that okay, this entity does not exist in the database, and it throws you an exception. Okay, one more point I would like to add is that load method does not always returns you a proxy object. It will return a proxy object when it will not find the entity instance in the persistence cache or a session cache. Then it will return you a proxy. Otherwise, it will return you that entity instance which is attached to the session cache. So to understand this point, let's what we'll do is we'll first load the address entity using the get API so that this entity instance is available in the session cache, and when a load API is going to fetch this entity instance, then it will return that instance from the session cache itself. So this time a proxy will not be returned. So let's execute this and verify this understanding. So this time you can see that the type of object returned by this load method is not a proxy. Also, let's try to reverse this scenario. That is, first entity instance is fetched via load API, and after that it is fetched via the get API. So in that case, what type of object will be returned by this get API? Let's analyze that. Okay, so let's run this example, and now you can see that the get API is also returning you the proxy object. So what is happening is that the first time the load method was executed, a proxy was returned, and this proxy was associated with the session cache. So next time you are firing a get API, the get API will pick the same proxy from the session cache, and it will initialize that proxy. It will not create a new object and return you that. It will reuse the proxy, uninitialized proxy, and it will fire the select query and populate that proxy itself. So these things, please keep these things in mind. Okay, so now we know the basic functionality of get and load APIs. So now let's have a quick discussion about when to use what. Okay, so number one, if you're not sure whether a instance exists in the database or not, then it is better to go for get. Why? Because get will return you a null object, and you can do the null check in your code and will come to know. Whereas in case of load, you'll get an exception only when you try to fetch some property of that entity. So it's better to go for this get. Okay, so the second point is performance. So the performance of session.load is better than session.get, obviously, because session.get results in a DB query being fired and session.load does not. So when you're trying to fetch some object from the database and you don't want to access the non-primary attributes of that object, then it is better to go for this session.load. So let's take an example of this in our code. So let's say that I'm trying to save a new customer object in my database, and a customer object is having a reference to address object. So what I am doing here is that this customer is having a reference to a already existing address. That is, I'm trying to associate address with ID 1 to this customer. So what I have done is that I have performed a session.load of this address, and then I have used this instance to associate it with my customer. So if I run this, a new customer instance will be inserted in the database, and you see that no select query is fired for the address because we have used the session.load. So when you are not accessing any non-primary attributes of this address object, then it is better to go for this session.load in such a scenario. So I hope the point is clear. So that is all for this discussion. To summarize what we have discussed in this tutorial, I have added this slide so you can go through it and revalidate our discussion points. Thanks a lot for watching this video. Thank you.